All right, so you probably saw the news this week. Big news, Postmaster General Louis DeJoy resigned on Monday, kind of out of the blue.
Yeah, it was pretty abrupt.
Especially because he's been working for, what, almost 5 years now to get the USPS's finances stabilized, and he's actually in the middle of this reorganization plan.
Right in the middle of it.
So the timing is just, makes you think.
Yeah, the timing is really interesting, especially when you think about the context of everything that's been going on.
Yeah.
DeJoy was brought in to really try to fix those financial problems that the Postal Service has had for so long.
Right.
And now he's leaving pretty suddenly, just as the Trump administration is signaling that they want to maybe have a little more control over how the USPS operates.
Yeah, and a lot of people, critics of the administration, are already saying that this is just the first step in a hostile takeover.
Right.
That they're eventually going to try and break up the USPS or sell it off completely, which wouldn't be totally out of left field. We know that Trump in the past has said that he's interested in possibly bringing the Postal Service under the Department of Commerce or, even full-on privatizing it.
Yeah, and I think that this really fits in with the pattern that we've seen from this administration of looking at these really big established government agencies and saying, hey, are these operating the way that they should be? Are there ways that we could restructure them?
Right.
And obviously the USPS, with its huge network and its mission to serve the entire public, it's a really big part of the federal government.
Right.
So it kind of makes sense that they would turn their attention to that.
Yeah, and the timing of it, too, because this all comes right after DeJoy invited Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. But anyway, they invited DOGE to come in and identify, areas of waste or, where they could improve things at the USPS. So it's like they were already kind of setting the stage for, some big changes.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way.
And, of course, the American Postal Workers Union is not happy about this at all.
Yeah, as you can imagine.
They're calling it an attack by oligarchs and warning that if the USPS gets privatized, prices are going to go up. Service quality, especially in rural areas, is going to go down.
Of course. And this really highlights the fundamental tension here, right?
Yeah.
The Postal Service is a public service, but there's also this drive from certain corners to make it more profit-driven.
Right.
And the union is really fighting to preserve the idea that the USPS should be focused on serving the public good.
Yeah, and they're making some legal arguments, too, saying, the USPS was created by Congress. It's an independent agency.
Right.
That was the whole point, to keep it free from political interference and focused on serving all Americans.
Right.
And they're saying that the power to hire or fire the Postmaster General belongs to the USPS Board of Governors.
Right.
And that if the administration tries to go around that process, that's unlawful.
Yeah, and this really raises the question of separation of powers, right? And the idea that certain parts of the government are meant to be autonomous.
Right.
The Postal Reorganization Act of 1970 was really important in creating that independence for the USPS.
Right.
So any attempt to undermine that is probably going to face some serious legal challenges.
Yeah, so that brings us to Howard Lutnick, who is the new Secretary of Commerce. He just took office in February.
Just a couple of months ago.
And he's already put forward some pretty significant proposals about what he wants to do with the USPS.
Yeah, he's hitting the ground running.
He does. And he's coming from a pretty business-heavy background. He was the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is a major financial services company.
Right.
So I think it's safe to say he's probably going to have a pretty business-oriented approach to the agency.
Yeah, it's definitely a safe bet.
So the big question is, what could the USPS look like if his vision becomes reality? What changes might we see to, the mail service that we all use?
Yeah, we have a lot of different factors converging here, right? We have a Postmaster General on his way out.
Right.
We have a new Commerce Secretary who's coming in with a very strong business background.
Right.
And some very specific ideas about how he thinks the USPS should operate.
Yeah.
And then we also have this clear interest from the administration as a whole in reshaping the agency.
Right.
So let's dive into what Lutnick's vision seems to be and what the potential consequences could be.
So let's break it down. One of the big ideas that keeps coming up is this idea of integrating the USPS into the Department of Commerce.
Right, bringing it under the Commerce Secretary's direct control.
Yeah, which could even mean getting rid of the Board of Governors, which is, a pretty huge change right off the bat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That board is really important. They're responsible for overseeing everything the Postal Service does.
Yeah.
They appoint the Postmaster General, and they're really there to make sure that the USPS can function without political interference.
Right, and the argument for doing away with the board is that it would streamline things, make the USPS more efficient.
Right. The thinking is that if the Postal Service is more closely aligned with a cabinet-level department, like the Department of Commerce, which is all about economic stuff,
right,
then it might be easier to address those financial problems that we've talked about and maybe find ways to make things run a little more smoothly.
right. And speaking of those financial problems, the USPS has been losing money for a long time. We're talking over $100 billion in losses since 2007.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
So obviously people are looking for ways to fix that, and one of Lutnick's big ideas is to have the USPS conduct the census.
Yeah, that's a really interesting proposal when you think about it. The USPS has a massive infrastructure. It reaches literally every household in the country.
Right.
So Lutnick's argument is that using that existing network and workforce could be a much cheaper way to do the census.
Right.
Compared to how the Census Bureau does it now.
Yeah, he's even suggested that it could save like $40 billion every 10 years.
Right.
Which, I mean, that number might be a little optimistic.
Yeah, a little bit, especially since the 2020 census only cost about $14 billion.
Right.
But, the general idea is there, right? Use postal workers to deliver census forms, collect the data, maybe even do follow-up interviews.
Right.
Make the most of that existing workforce.
Yeah. But it makes you wonder, would it really be that much cheaper, and how would it work in practice?
Yeah, those are the big questions, right?
Because, mail carriers, they make more than the temporary workers that they usually hire for the census.
That's right. And then you have to think about the logistics of it all. Could they really add census duties on top of their regular mail routes without it becoming a total mess?
Right. And would mail carriers even be the right people to do this? They're not trained in how to collect census data properly.
Right. There are very specific protocols and procedures,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure the data is accurate and confidential.
Right. And think about it. Most people get their mail during the day, but if you need to do a follow-up interview for the census, you're probably going to have to go in the evening or on the weekend when people are more likely to be home.
That's a really good point. And you also have to think about places like big cities where people get their mail from those cluster boxes.
Right.
The mail carrier isn't going door to door.
Right.
So how would they even reach those people for the census?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's not just the census. Lutnick is also talking about having the USPS take on other government tasks like delivering Social Security forms.
Yeah, this idea of expanding the USPS's role beyond mail delivery is really interesting.
Right.
Like they're envisioning it becoming this all-purpose government service provider.
Right.
Handling all kinds of sensitive information and taking over responsibilities that other agencies are currently doing.
Yeah, like they see this huge network that the USPS has, and they're thinking, why aren't we using this for more things?
Right.
But again, you have to think about the practicalities of it and the legal issues.
Exactly. And that's where the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970 comes in again.
Right.
That law was really important in establishing the USPS as an independent agency.
Right.
And legal experts are saying that if the president tries to bring the USPS under the Commerce Department without Congress getting involved, that would probably violate that law.
Yeah, and the unions are obviously not thrilled about this whole thing either. I mean, they're willing to talk about maybe taking on some new roles.
Sure.
But they see this as a hostile takeover and a step towards privatization.
Right.
Which is their biggest fear.
Right.
They're worried about what it would mean for service quality and the cost of postage, especially in rural areas.
Right. Because those communities rely so heavily on the Postal Service.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you talk about privatization, what does that even mean? Does it mean selling off parts of the USPS infrastructure or outsourcing delivery in certain areas?
Yeah. There are a lot of different ways that it could play out.
And it's important to remember that the unions represent the people who are actually doing the work.
Absolutely.
The mail carriers, the clerks, the people who are going to be most affected by these changes.
Right.
So their concerns about having more work piled on them, needing special training to do things like census taking and the possibility of political interference, those are all valid concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting that Trump himself has talked about this. He mentioned at Lutnick's swearing-in ceremony.
Right.
That he's interested in exploring some kind of merger for the USPS.
Yeah.
Because of those financial losses that we keep talking about.
Right. So it's clear that this isn't just Lutnick's idea.
No, it seems like this is something that's coming from the top.
So we're looking at a potential future where the USPS is part of the Department of Commerce, maybe without its own independent board.
Right.
Maybe in charge of the census, delivering Social Security forms, and who knows what else.
It's a pretty big shift.
Yeah. And the argument for all of this is that it will save money and make the USPS more efficient.
Right. The idea is to take advantage of that huge network that the USPS already has.
Right.
And use it to do more things for the government.
Yeah, but there are some big roadblocks. The experts are saying that using postal workers for the census might not actually save money.
Right.
And there's the whole legal question of whether the administration can even do this without Congress's approval.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the concerns that the unions have raised.
Right.
About the potential impact on postal workers and on the quality of service.
Yeah. So this whole push to reshape the USPS, it really makes you think, oh, what's going to happen to this essential service?
Yeah.
Will these changes actually make things better for taxpayers, or will they end up hurting the very mission of the Postal Service?
Right. To deliver mail affordably and reliably to everyone in the country.
It's a really important question, and the answer is going to have a huge impact on all of us.
Yeah, it's something we'll all have to watch closely.